The wind never truly stopped out here. It swept across the dry hills like a restless spirit, carrying whispers of old ghosts and long-forgotten promises. I stood on the edge of the ridge, boots dug into cracked earth, watching the sun sink low behind the western horizon. The sky bled deep orange, burning the clouds with light that seemed almost alive. I didn't bother to blink. That color, that light, it was the same shade that stained my memories. The same that marked the last time I saw her smile. My name is Silas Hartley, and for years I've carried a silence heavier than any storm. My ranch lies at the forgotten edge of this land, a place where folks don't come unless they have no choice. A place they whisper about like it's haunted. Maybe it is. Maybe it's haunted by grief, by loss, by the echoes of a family torn apart. I never wanted company, never asked for it. But the world had different plans. The house I live in leans like a weary old man. Shingles missing, windows shuttered tight. Inside, the air is thick with dust and memories, with shadows that stretch long across the floor. There's one photograph on the mantel, my boy, Elijah, dressed in his Union blue, standing tall with eyes full of hope and something fierce I couldn't teach him. He's gone now, like so much else. Gone to a war that stole more than it ever gave. On this evening, as the chill crept in and the last birds fell silent, I heard something that hadn't touched my door in years, a knock. Heavy, purposeful, not the timid tapping of strangers, but the kind that demands you listen. I opened to find them standing there, like legends come to life. 10 Apache warriors, tall and steady, wrapped in blankets soaked with rain and earth. Their horses shifted behind them, muscles tense beneath dripping manes. The oldest, with eyes like ancient rivers and a braid threaded with bone beads, spoke in careful English. "We ask shelter until the storm passes." I didn't speak, just stepped aside. Something in their quiet presence pulled at a part of me I thought had died with my family. I told them to leave their horses in the barn, where hay and water waited. They moved silently, respectful as shadows, filling the empty house with a quiet dignity I hadn't known it could hold. The storm came roaring in that night, thunder shaking the walls and wind keening like a morning song. Inside, around a fire that flickered soft light on unfamiliar faces, I poured bitter coffee and watched them settle in. No one spoke much. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was heavy with stories of land, of blood, of broken promises and quiet resilience. One young warrior, barely more than a boy, caught sight of Elijah's photograph. His eyes lingered, then he reached into his pouch and placed a small carved bird of stone on the table in front of me. No words followed, none were needed. That stone felt like a bridge, a fragile promise between strangers bound by loss. The night stretched long. Outside, the rain hammered the roof like fists. But inside that old house, something fragile began to grow, a bond forged in quiet understanding, in shared grief, in the fierce hope that even broken wings remember the sky. The dawn crept in slowly, casting pale light through the cracked windows of the old Hartley ranch. The storm had passed, but the heavy scent of wet earth lingered, mingled with the faint smoke of last night's fire. I woke early, the house still holding on to its quiet, like it too was hesitant to move forward. The warriors were still asleep in the back rooms, shadows stretched long across the wooden floorboards. I poured water from the basin at the sink and splashed it across my face, the cold bite pulling me awake, wrenching me back from memories that never truly left. I traced the edge of the stone bird the young warrior, Nantan, had placed on the table the night before. It was smooth and cool, like a talisman born from silence and sorrow. For years, I lived with silence as my only companion. It was easier that way. Easier than answering questions I couldn't bear. Easier than facing the empty chair beside me or the grave beyond the ridge. The war took Elijah, but it also took pieces of me I never found again. I kept to the edges of the town, and the town kept me at arm's length. Dry Fork folks liked their distance, whispered their suspicions. "That ranch is cursed," they said. "Silas Hartley's lost his mind. talking to ghosts and sheltering strangers. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had gone soft. Or maybe I just learned what fear really meant. I dressed slowly, my boots heavy on the wooden porch. The morning was cool, the air still carrying the promise of rain later. The Apache warriors stirred one by one. Taza, their chief, stood near the barn, tending to the horses with quiet care. He moved with a grace that felt ancient, like the land itself had shaped him. He caught my eye and nodded once, a small, unspoken greeting that felt like the first thread in a fragile friendship. They weren't just warriors, they were survivors. Men who had faced death and loss in ways I couldn't imagine. And yet they carried themselves with a dignity that seemed to fill the empty spaces in my house. Their presence was a reminder that I wasn't the only one haunted by ghosts. Breakfast was simple oats, salted with a pinch of sugar, and black coffee strong enough to burn the tongue. We ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of tin bowls and the slow breathing of men who had long since stopped needing words to feel understood. Occasionally, a low word drifted from their language, a melody I couldn't follow but found strangely soothing. After breakfast, the men moved to repair the broken fence along the eastern pasture. I joined them, handing nails and passing tools. Their movements were deliberate and efficient, shaped by years of necessity. Nantan, pale but determined, worked alongside with trembling hands, his coughing a harsh reminder of the sickness still clinging to him. I didn't ask questions. There was no need. Their eyes told stories of raids, of escape, of kin lost to whiskey and war, of a land that had taken more than it ever gave. The land held wounds older than any of us, and the scars showed in every furrowed brow, every careful step. By midday, the quiet was broken by a noise I had hoped never to hear again. The sound of horses approaching. Not the calm, steady gait of a traveler, but the heavy, determined thunder of men riding hard. My heart tightened. The world outside these hills didn't want us here, not the way we were. Not with the blood we carried and the stories we told. Deputy Jed Cobb rode up the lane, flanked by 4 others, eyes narrowed beneath a wide hat. He was a man built for conflict, all bark and no bite, but I could see the hard edge in his gaze. He scanned the yard like a wolf eyeing prey. "You got visitors, Hartley?" His voice was rough, like gravel dragged across wood. I met his gaze steadily. "Just guests." Jed spat into the dirt. "Heard smoke here last night. Lights in your window. Sheltering Apaches, I reckon?" I said nothing. My silence was a wall as solid as the one I helped patch earlier that day. Jed narrowed his eyes further. "You know what folks think of them? You sure you want to play that game?" I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. "I ain't interested in what folks think." They knocked. I opened the door. Jed's hand twitched near his pistol belt. "You don't owe them nothing. They took enough from men like you." The words stung not because they were false, but because I knew the truth behind them. I had lost more than I could count, and the world saw only the scars, never the man who bore them. Before I could answer, Taza stepped out from the barn, tall and steady as a mountain. No words passed between us, but his presence spoke louder than any speech. Jed's eyes flicked toward the chief, tension crackling like dry wood ready to snap. "Think carefully, Hartley," Jed said low. "Town won't look kindly on this." "I've already thought it through," I said quietly. "They knocked," I answered. "And if you come with fire, you won't leave with it." Jed's men shifted uneasily. The threat hung between us like a storm about to break. Then, with a grunt, Jed turned his horse and rode back down the lane, leaving dust and bitter air in his wake. The afternoon sun dipped low, painting the hills in golden shadow. The threat had come. A warning wrapped in law and order, but the real danger was yet to come. We all knew it. Inside, the house felt different, no longer just a refuge, but a battleground waiting to be claimed. The warriors prepared quietly, moving furniture, sharpening knives, stacking firewood with purpose. Nantan rested, wrapped in a quilt, his breath steadier but still weak. I sat by the fire late into the night, Elijah's photo pressed between rough hands. The weight of what lay ahead settled deep in my chest. We were bound by grief, by defiance, and by a hope fragile as the dawn. And as the wind whispered against the old walls, I realized this was no longer just my fight. It was ours. The night swallowed the ranch in shadows deeper than any I'd felt before. The fire crackled low, casting flickers of light across worn wooden beams and the faces of the men who had come seeking refuge in my broken house. I sat near the hearth, Elijah's faded photograph folded in my hands, tracing the lines of a smile I longed to see again. Around me, the Apache warriors moved with a quiet purpose, Taza tending to their weapons, others murmuring softly in their native tongue. Their eyes held stories of battles fought far from this forgotten land, but also of a resilience so fierce it burned through the darkest nights. I envied them, in a way. To carry such strength in a world that had tried to break them. Nantan, the youngest among them, sat by the window, his coughing still ragged but less frequent. The boy was a puzzle too young for the hardened warrior's life he'd been forced into, yet with a fire in his eyes that refused to be extinguished. He caught my gaze and nodded faintly. No words passed between us, but in that simple gesture was a trust I hadn't expected. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the trees like a warning. It carried with it the scent of smoke and distant voices. The world beyond Dry Fork was restless, and it wasn't long before that restlessness found its way to my doorstep. The next morning dawned cold and gray. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds threatening rain. I found myself standing at the fence line, watching the horizon, waiting for a storm that felt more than just weather. The men were silent but watchful, the kind of silence that precedes a storm not of nature but of man. Hours later, the sound I dreaded echoed through the valley, hooves pounding hard against dirt, voices shouting orders, the unmistakable clatter of weapons. Jed Cobb had returned, this time with a small militia of townsfolk, faces hard and eyes full of suspicion and fear. "Step aside, Hartley," Jed called out, his voice carrying a warning. "You're harboring fugitives. We can't have that in Dry Fork." I met his gaze squarely, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. "They're not fugitives, they're survivors, and they're under my protection." Laughter erupted from the crowd, bitter, mocking. "Protection? You're playing with fire, old man. You don't know what these people are capable of." Taza stepped forward then, his voice calm but firm as he spoke in English. "We seek only peace. We have harmed no one." But words fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk were already raising rifles, faces twisted with anger and fear. The line between law and mob had blurred, and I knew this was no longer just about shelter or survival. It was a reckoning. "Stand down!" I shouted, raising my hands. "You want to fight? You'll find one here, but don't say I didn't warn you." The militia hesitated, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, a shot rang out sharp, echoing across the valley. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, guns fired, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and sweat. I dove to the ground, heart pounding, ears ringing. Around me, the warriors sprang into action, defending the house, the horses, the fragile bond we'd built. Nantan was at my side, his face pale but determined. "We must hold," he gasped. "They cannot break us." Hours passed in a blur of violence and fear. When the dust finally settled, the militia had retreated, leaving behind broken fences and burning embers. But the victory was hollow. We had won a battle, yes, but the war was far from over. That night, as I tended to wounds and counted the losses, a new resolve took root inside me. I had given these men shelter once. Now, I would stand with them against whatever storm was coming. Elijah's photo rested on the table, a silent reminder of what I fought for, not just the memory of my son, but for a future where no one would be hunted for who they were. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't known in a long time: hope. The dawn cracked over Dry Fork with an unnatural stillness. The kind that feels like the calm before a storm you've been trying to outrun all your life. I stood outside the battered farmhouse, the smell of smoke lingering in the cold morning air. The ground was churned by hooves and boot prints, a chaotic testament to last night's battle that still haunted my muscles and mind. Inside, the men were silent, nursing wounds both visible and hidden. Taza sat by the window, sharpening his blade with a slow, steady rhythm that somehow calmed the room. His dark eyes flicked up as I entered. "We can't stay here much longer," he said, voice low, weighed by the certainty of a man who had seen too many battles. "Jedcob will come back, and next time he'll bring more than just angry townsfolk." I nodded. The militia retreat was only temporary. I could feel it in my bones. The fight was far from over. And the fragile truce between Dry Fork's desperate men and the Apache survivors was cracking beneath the weight of suspicion and hate. Outside, the wind picked up again, cold and unforgiving, rattling the loose boards of the farmhouse. Nantan sat by the hearth, wrapped in a worn blanket, his face drawn but fierce. The cough still rattled his chest, a cruel reminder of the past he couldn't escape, but his eyes burned with determination. "They won't find peace in hatred," I said quietly, staring into the fire. "Not while fear controls them." The others murmured in agreement. We had to make a plan. The men who had come with Jed weren't just angry, they were afraid. And fear was the kindling that could set the entire valley ablaze. I walked over to the window, peering out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to climb, painting the clouds in streaks of red and gold. The land stretched wide and empty, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it was crawling with danger. "We need allies," I said finally. "This valley can't be ours alone to defend." Taza nodded slowly. "There are others beyond the Ridge Rangers, settlers, even some who sympathize with our cause. But reaching them means crossing territory held by men who won't hesitate to shoot on sight. Then we send a message," I said, turning to face them all. "A message that says we're not hiding, that we won't be hunted. We show them we can fight, but also that there's something worth protecting." That night, we gathered what little we had: food, weapons, and worn clothes that smelled of dust and smoke. The plan was risky. I would ride to a nearby trading post to send word to an old friend who might help us. Taza and a few warriors would stay to guard the ranch and care for the wounded. As I saddled my horse beneath the cold moonlight, Nantan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the wheezing cough that lingered. "Let me go with you." I looked at the boy, seeing the fierce spirit beneath his fragile frame. "No, it's too dangerous." He shook his head. "I don't care. I want to fight for what's ours. I want to prove that I'm not just a boy to be protected." There was fire in his eyes that mirrored my own defiance. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Then you ride with me, but stay close. No foolish risks." The journey was grueling. The trail twisted through dense forests and rocky outcrops, where silence was a weapon, and every shadow a threat. We rode hard, hearts pounding against the cold night air. The stars above were the only witnesses to our secret flight. As dawn broke again, we reached the trading post, a weather-beaten cluster of buildings that looked like they'd been carved from the earth itself. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and sweat, and the few souls awake eyed us with suspicion. I found my friend Caleb, an old scout who knew these lands better than anyone. His eyes widened when I told him our story. "You're riding into a hornet's nest," he said grimly. "But you're right, the valley's on edge. If you want help, you'll need to prove you're not just victims." We agreed to send word to a nearby fort and some sympathetic settlers willing to stand against the growing militia threat. But it wouldn't be fast. Days, maybe weeks, before reinforcements could arrive. As we prepared to leave, a messenger burst into the trading post, breathless and wild-eyed. "Militia's marching on Dry 400 strong. They've burned the old Miller farm and they're coming this way." The weight of those words crushed the air from my lungs. Time had run out. "Caleb," I said, gripping his arm. "We ride back, fast." The ride home was a desperate race against time. The valley stretched endlessly, but every minute felt like an eternity. Nantan urged his horse harder, cough forgotten in the fire of urgency. When we reached the ridge overlooking Dry Fork, smoke billowed in thick plumes, black against the morning sky. The militia had come, and they had brought war. Below, the ranch was surrounded, flames licking the edges of dry brush and wooden fences. The warriors fought fiercely, their cries echoing across the valley. I felt a hollow twist in my chest. We were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outwilled. "Nantan," I shouted over the chaos, "we hold the line no matter what." His eyes locked on mine, fierce and unyielding. Together, we charged down into the fray, ready to face whatever darkness the valley threw at us. The battle stretched through the day and into night, the air thick with smoke, gunpowder, and blood. Men fell on both sides, but the spirit of those defending Dry Fork burned brighter than any flame. I found myself side by side with Taza, our blades moving in brutal harmony, cutting down the militia's advance. Nantan fought like a storm's maul, fierce, unstoppable. At one point, a sniper's bullet tore through the air, grazing my shoulder. Pain flared, but adrenaline drowned it out. There was no room for weakness here. Amid the chaos, I caught sight of Jed Cobb rallying his men, shouting venomous threats. His face was twisted with hate, but I could see the cracks in his resolve. Tomorrow, I thought, he'll pay for this. When the dust finally settled, the ground was littered with the cost of war. But Dry Fork stood. That night, as we gathered around the fire, wounded but alive, the weight of what we had faced pressed down on us. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something fierce and unbreakable hope. We weren't just survivors anymore, we were warriors. And this valley was our home. I looked at Nantan, his face smeared with dirt and sweat but eyes shining with the fire of youth. "This is only the beginning," I told him softly. He nodded. "Then let's be ready." And as the stars blinked above, the quiet valley whispered its promise. We would fight, we would endure, and one day we would be free. The nights in Dry Fork were no longer silent. The once peaceful valley had transformed into a restless battlefield where shadows moved like whispers of dread, and every flicker of firelight held a story of pain, hope, or defiance. Our small band of defenders bore scars that told of battle, but also the stubborn will to protect what little we had left. I woke that morning with my shoulder aching from the bullet wound. The pain was a constant reminder that even survival came at a cost. But pain was easier to bear than the fear lingering in the air, fear, not just of the militia, but of what the future might bring. Taza was already awake, standing by the window, his gaze fixed on the distant hills where the first rays of sun cut through the fog. He looked older somehow, hardened by the night's fighting but unbroken. "We can't hold out forever," he said quietly when I joined him. "The militia's numbers grow, and reinforcements we hoped for haven't arrived." I nodded grimly. "We'll need to change tactics. If we keep fighting like this, we'll bleed out." Nantan entered the room, his face still marked by the grime of battle but eyes burning with determination. "I want to train more men," he said fiercely. "We need every able body ready." It was a bold plan, but necessary. The militia had forced us into a war we never wanted, and we needed to become more than just survivors. We had to become fighters, strategists. The next days were a blur of activity. We scoured the valley for able men and women willing to stand with us, teaching them how to use rifles, how to move silently, how to trust one another. I watched Nantan grow into a leader before my eyes, his youthful energy channeling into something fierce and inspiring. But not everyone in Dry Fork was ready to fight. Fear had fractured the town. Some wanted to surrender, others wanted to flee. And lurking beneath the surface, old prejudices simmered, threatening to tear us apart from within. One afternoon, as we drilled a small group near the creek, a figure approached cautiously. It was Clara, a school teacher from the other side of town, someone many had trusted for years. "I want to help," she said softly, eyes steady despite the danger. "We can't let hate win." Her presence was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that this was more than just a battle for land, it was a fight for the soul of the valley. But trouble was never far. That night, the militia returned, this time bringing reinforcements of their own. Their war cries shattered the fragile peace, and the battle once again tore through the darkness. We fought fiercely, but the militia's numbers were overwhelming. Taza fell during the fight, a deep wound to his side. We dragged him back inside, his breath shallow and labored. "Don't let me be the end," he whispered, gripping my hand tightly. Lead them to peace." His words shook me. Taza was more than a warrior, he was a symbol of hope, and now that hope rested on my shoulders. As dawn broke over Dry Fork, the weight of loss settled heavily. Taza's death left a void, but also a spark. The men and women who remained gathered around me, eyes full of trust and fear and a fierce desire to survive. "We will not let his sacrifice be in vain," I told them, voice steady despite the storm inside.
"We fight smarter, we fight together."
Nantan stepped forward, now fully embracing his role as a leader. "We'll split into smaller groups," he said. "Hit them where it hurts. Slow their advance. This valley is our home, and we know every inch better than they do." Plans were drawn, whispered under breath in the dead of night, as we prepared for the coming days. The militia would come again, they always did, but we were no longer just hiding. We were ready to strike back. But war is never just about battles. The real war is fought in hearts. That week, Clara and I sat by the dwindling firelight, sharing stories of what this land meant to each of us. She spoke of her father, a man who had believed in unity despite the odds, and of the children she taught who deserved a future free of fear. "I'm scared," she admitted, "not just of the militia, but of what we might become if we lose ourselves." I understood that fear better than most. The line between justice and vengeance was thin, and every choice we made could tip the scales. "We have to remember who we are," I told her, "even in the darkest times." The days that followed were a war of attrition. Small victories came with heavy losses. We ambushed supply lines, sabotaged weapons caches, and slowly the militia's grip weakened. But their leader, Jed Cobb, grew more ruthless, desperate to crush the resistance. Rumors spread that he was planning a final assault, a merciless strike meant to break our spirit once and for all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nantan returned from a scouting mission, his face pale. "They're gathering," he said. "More than we've seen before. They want to end this now." The valley held its breath. The night before the assault, we gathered one last time in the farmhouse. Faces worn but resolute, we shared stories and laughter, an act of defiance against the shadow of war. Nantan, standing taller than ever, raised a hand. "We fight not just for Dry Fork, but for the future. For those who cannot fight, for hope." His words echoed in the silence, and I felt something stir inside me, a fierce, unyielding fire. Tomorrow would be the hardest day of our lives, but we would face it together. The dawn arrived like a distant thunder, a low rumble that vibrated through the very bones of Dry Fork. The valley, once shrouded in the soft mist of early morning, now trembled beneath the weight of an approaching storm, not one of rain, but of steel and fire. The militia was coming, and with them, a tide of destruction that threatened to wash away everything we held dear. We awoke that morning to the cold sting of anticipation. The farmhouse, where we had gathered the night before in a fragile act of hope, was now a fortress bristling with makeshift barricades and armed souls whose eyes burned with determination and fear alike. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat, and every heartbeat seemed to count down the seconds until the inevitable clash. I stood beside Nantan, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down like a mountain. Taza's words echoed in my mind, his final plea for me to lead, to guide our people through this darkness. It was a burden I had not sought, but one I could not refuse. This was no longer a fight for survival, it was a fight for the very soul of Dry Fork. "Remember," I told the gathered fighters, "this isn't just about weapons and tactics. It's about who we are. Hold on to that, fight for that." Nantan nodded, his jaw clenched. We split into 3 groups just like we planned. Strike fast, hit hard, then disappear. Keep their forces off balance. We don't have their numbers, but we have something stronger or home. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that danced over the valley as if the land itself was holding its breath. From my vantage point near the ridge, I could see the militia's forces assembling a dark river of men and machines winding down the hills toward us. Their war cries shattered the morning silence, a brutal reminder of the hatred driving them. But beneath the noise, I felt a pulse of something else, an unyielding spirit in the defenders of Dry Fork. The first wave hit just past noon. It came like a whirlwind of chaos and fire, the militia crashing against our lines with reckless fury. Our defenders fought fiercely, every shot and blade a prayer, every breath a promise not to give up. Nantan's group struck swiftly, ambushing a supply convoy on the eastern ridge. They moved like shadows, invisible and lethal, cutting off the militia's lifeline and forcing them to scatter. The sound of explosions and gunfire echoed through the valley, a grim symphony of war. But the militia was relentless. Jed Cobb, their merciless leader, was there in the midst of it, his eyes burning with fury. His voice carried over the battlefield, barking orders that drove his men forward with savage precision. Our defenses held, but only barely. Men fell beside me, friends and strangers alike, faces frozen in moments of courage and pain. I carried on, pushing past exhaustion and fear, driven by the memory of those who had fallen before me. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the fighting slowed to a brutal stalemate. The valley was scarred, the land torn and bleeding. We had inflicted serious damage, but our own losses were staggering. That night, we gathered what remained, tending wounds by firelight, and mourning those who would not rise again. The farmhouse was quiet, save for the whispered prayers and the soft sobs of grief. Clara sat beside me, her hands trembling as she cleaned a young man's wounds. "How much longer can we keep this up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have numbers. Weapons. They will break us." I looked into her eyes and saw the same fear that haunted my own heart. "We have to believe," I said softly. "Belief is the strongest weapon we have." She nodded, but I could see the weight of doubt pressing down on her like a shadow. The next morning brought no relief. The militia regrouped, their forces swelling with reinforcements we had not anticipated. Jed Cobb's shadow loomed larger than ever. Word came that they planned to encircle us, cutting off any chance of escape or aid. It was a desperate move, but one that could mean the end for Dry Fork. Nantan convened a council, his face grim.
We can't hold out against a siege. We have to break through now. If we don't, it's over.
I studied the faces around me, brave men and women who had already given so much. "Then we make our stand," I said. "Not just to survive, but to ensure that Dry Fork's spirit lives on." Plans were drawn under the flickering light of lanterns. We would strike at the militia's weakest point, a narrow pass near the river, hoping to break their lines and buy time. The assault on the pass was brutal beyond words. We fought in the shadows of towering cliffs, the roar of gunfire mingling with the crashing of the river below. Men slipped and fell, swallowed by the merciless currents or buried beneath rockslides triggered by explosions. I found myself face to face with one of the militia's commanders, a cold-eyed man named Harper. Our clash was swift and deadly, a desperate dance of survival. When it ended, he lay still, and I was left trembling, the weight of taking a life sinking deep into my soul. But there was no time to grieve. The battle raged on, every inch of ground hard won. By nightfall, we had broken through the militia's encirclement, but at a terrible cost. Many were wounded, and the survivors were exhausted to the bone. As we limped back toward the valley, a strange silence fell over the group. The war had changed us all, shaped by loss, fear, but also an unbreakable bond forged in fire. Clara approached me once more, her eyes shining with tears. "You were right," she said. "Hope is our strongest weapon, and I believe no matter what happens, that spirit will live on." I smiled, though my heart was heavy. We fight not because we want to, but because we must, for those who cannot. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, I allowed myself a moment to grieve. For Taza, for the friends lost, for the valley that had become our battleground. But I also felt a flicker of promise that the fight was not over. That even in the darkest night, there is a dawn. Tomorrow, we would face whatever came next. Together. The night after the battle was heavy with silence, but it was the kind of silence that screamed each quiet moment, weighed down by memories of the fallen and the unspoken fears of those who remained. We huddled around the smoldering remnants of our campfires, the flickering flames casting long, trembling shadows across faces etched with exhaustion and grief. The valleys seemed to hold its breath, as if it too mourned the scars left upon its soil. I sat near Clara, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cold water, eyes distant and haunted. She broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. How many more must we lose to keep this fight alive? I don't know if I can carry this much longer. Her words struck me deep, but I held myself steady. It's not about how long we carry it, Clara. It's about why we carry it. We fight because if we don't, everything we love will be lost. She nodded, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. It was a doubt I felt creeping inside me too, like a shadow slowly swallowing the light. Morning came with a cold bite, the chills seeping into our bones and reminding us that this fight was far from over. Reports arrived from scouts. Jed Cobb's militia was not just regrouping, they were preparing for a full-scale siege. Their reinforcements were arriving faster than we anticipated, their forces swelling like a tidal wave ready to crush us beneath its weight. The reality settled over us like a storm cloud. We had delayed the inevitable, but we could not outrun it forever. In the early hours, Nantan called a meeting. The small room was crowded, the air thick with tension. His voice was steady but grave. We face a new challenge. The militia has cut off all supply routes. No food, no medicine, no reinforcements. We can't hold out for long unless we do something drastic. A murmur ran through the group. I could see the panic lurking behind brave faces. We need to strike at the heart of their operation, I said, feeling the weight of leadership press harder. Jed Cobb's command center. If we take him down, we break their morale. Nantan nodded slowly. It's risky, but it may be our only chance. Preparation began immediately. We gathered what few resources remained: old rifles, sharpened tools, homemade explosives. Every man and woman was ready, knowing full well this might be a mission from which none returned. As we moved under the cover of darkness, the valley was transformed. What once had been a place of safety and home now felt alien and hostile, the shadows thick with danger. The journey to the militia's command post was perilous, winding through jagged rocks and dense forests, each step echoing with the possibility of discovery. Clara walked beside me, her resolve hardening. "We can do this," she said, gripping my arm. "For Dry Fork." Her words gave me strength, even as fear curled like ice in my stomach. The command center came into view just before dawn, a makeshift fortress of metal and concrete, surrounded by watchtowers and armed guards. The militia's flag fluttered in the early light, a dark banner of conquest and oppression. We split into 3 teams, each with a specific objective. My team's was to infiltrate the command post and eliminate Jed Cobb. We moved silently, shadows among shadows, slipping past patrols and evading spotlights. Every breath was a stolen moment, every heartbeat a countdown to chaos. Inside the command tent, I found Jed Cobb's face twisted with fury as he barked orders into a radio. His cold eyes locked onto me just as I raised my rifle. There was no time for words. The firefight that followed was brutal and relentless. Bullets tore through the air, the sharp crack of gunfire mingling with screams of pain and rage. I ducked behind crates, firing with precision born of desperation. Around me, my comrades fought with everything they had, every movement a dance between life and death. Jed Cobb was a formidable opponent. He moved with a deadly grace, his eyes burning with hatred. We clashed more than once, exchanging blows and gunfire in a deadly game that left us both bleeding and exhausted. But in the end, it was resolve that won. As he faltered, I pressed forward, delivering the final blow that ended his reign of terror. The command center erupted into chaos without their leader. Confused militia forces scattered, their cohesion shattered. We seized the moment, striking with all our might, destroying supplies and communication lines. Victory was ours, but it came at a steep price. The battlefield was littered with bodies, and the cost of survival weighed heavily on our souls. As we retreated back to Dry Fork, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the valley in a fragile glow of hope. The war was far from over, but this victory was a Bicona reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and unity could light the way. I looked at the faces around me, tired, battered, but unbroken. We had lost much, but we had gained something greater, the knowledge that our spirit could never be crushed. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, Clara came to me once more. "This is far from over," she said softly. "But for the first time, I believe we might just make it." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. "We will, because Dry Fork isn't just a place. It's who we are." And in that moment, under the vast expanse of stars, I vowed that no matter what came next, we would stand together until the very end. The morning after the raid was a brittle kind of silence, not the heavy silence of morning, but a sharp, almost electric stillness. Our victory had disrupted Jed Cobb's militia, but it had also unleashed a new storm. Rumors spread like wildfire. Reinforcements were mobilizing, more brutal and merciless than ever before. And the command center, though crippled, was not completely destroyed. A shadow of the militia remained intact, ready to strike back with a vengeance. Dry Fork was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a symbol, fragile ember of resistance flickering against a dark, encroaching night. I walked through the settlement, my boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, watching the villagers quietly repairing what the war had shattered. Faces were etched with exhaustion, but beneath the weariness burned a stubborn flame of defiance. Children ran along cracked paths, laughter tentatively threading through the cold air like a fragile promise. Clara was nearby, speaking softly to the elders about how to ration what little food remained. Her resolve was a steady anchor, but I could see the toll this war was taking on her, the sleepless nights, the constant worry. "Are you holding up?" I asked, stepping beside her. She gave a small, tired smile. "As well as anyone can. But we can't stay on the defensive forever. We need to prepare." I nodded. "And that means we must be ready for what's coming." The council met again as dusk settled over Dry Fork. Nantan's voice was grim. "They are regrouping. Reports say the militia has hired mercenaries, men with no loyalty but gold and bloodlust. They'll come with fire and steel." The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the low crackle of the fire. I felt the weight of leadership more keenly than ever. We have to train. Every able-bodied person must be ready to fight, not just soldiers, but farmers, teachers, everyone. The murmurs of agreement were tinged with fear, but also determination. Training was brutal and unforgiving. Days blurred into nights as we drilled tactics, learned to handle weapons, and prepared for the inevitable siege. Clara led the medical unit, setting up makeshift clinics and teaching basic first aid, while I organized patrols and strategized defensive positions. One afternoon, while instructing a group of young recruits, a scout burst in with urgent news. Enemy forces spotted near the eastern ridge. They're advancing faster than expected. The room erupted into controlled chaos. I grabbed my gear and sprinted toward the ridge, heart pounding. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the jagged landscape. At the ridge, we found a sprawling force waiting mercenaries, clad in dark armor, their faces hidden behind grim masks. They moved with lethal precision, their weapons glinting ominously. The battle began without warning. Arrows flew, rifles cracked, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and blood. I fought with every ounce of strength, dodging and weaving, shouting orders through the cacophony. Amidst the chaos, Clara appeared at my side, a rifle in hand, eyes blazing with fierce determination. "We can't let them break through," she shouted. Together we held the line, rallying the defenders with sheer will. The clash was brutal, men and women falling, screaming, refusing to yield. Hours passed like minutes, each moment stretched by adrenaline and fear. As night fell, the mercenaries began to retreat, but not without leaving a scar on Dry Fork. Bodies littered the ground, and the air was thick with grief. Back in the village, we tended to the wounded, the cries of pain mixing with whispered prayers. Clara worked tirelessly, her hands steady even as tears threatened to fall. I found a moment to sit beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You saved so many today." She shook her head, voice soft. "We all did, but at what cost?" That night, sleep was elusive. I wandered to the edge of the settlement, staring up at the stars obscured by clouds. The weight of command pressed down, the faces of the fallen haunting my thoughts. Nantan joined me, his gaze steady. "You carry this burden well," I sighed. "Sometimes it feels too heavy," he nodded. "It's the burden of those who lead. But remember, you're not alone. We are many, and together we carry the future." Days turned to weeks. The siege tightened. Supplies dwindled. But Dry Fork endured. We sent scouts to gather intelligence, learned to anticipate the militia's moves. Clara and I grew closer in the crucible of war, finding strength in each other's presence amid the darkness. One evening as we sat by the fire, she leaned against me. "Do you think this will end?" I looked into her eyes, reflecting the flames. "It has to. For Dry Fork, for everyone who believes in a future beyond this war." Her fingers found mine, a silent promise. But fate was cruel. One cold morning, the village was shaken by a devastating explosion. The militia had launched a surprise attack on our supply depot fire, consuming months of hard-earned provisions. Panic surged through the camp. Without food, without medicine, our chances grew slimmer by the hour. In the aftermath, I gathered the survivors. "We must make a choice. Fight to the last breath here, or risk everything to break through their lines and seek help beyond the valley." The silence that followed was thick with fear and hope. Clara stepped forward. "We're not just fighting to survive, we're fighting to live. To carry this flame beyond Dry Fork." Her words sparked a fierce determination. We planned a desperate breakout. Under cover of darkness, a group of the strongest would attempt to slip past the militia's encirclement, seeking allies in the distant lands beyond the mountains. I volunteered to lead. The night of the escape was bitterly cold. Shadows swallowed us as we slipped through hidden paths, hearts pounding with the weight of hope and despair. Every crack of a twig, every distant shout, could mean discovery and death. The journey was grueling. Harsh terrain, bitter winds, and the constant threat of pursuit pressed down on us like a suffocating shroud. We lost some along the way: exhaustion, injury, and the cold claimed their toll. But we pressed on, driven by the memory of Dry Fork, by the faces of those who waited for us to succeed. One night, as we huddled in a narrow cave, Clara looked at me with fierce resolve. "We will make it. For them." Her words were a beacon in the darkness. As dawn broke on the 10th day, the outline of a distant settlement appeared, a cluster of lights, flickering like fireflies against the dark landscape. We had made it. Exhausted but unbroken, we prepared to plead for aid, to rally new allies, and bring the fight beyond the valley that had become our prison. But I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The settlement before us was a world away from Dry Fork, a sprawling enclave nestled in the shadows of towering cliffs, its walls etched with scars of battles past, yet alive with the bustle of hopeful survival. We had arrived at last, but the real challenge was only beginning. As we approached the gates, a cluster of wary guards eyed us with suspicion. Their armor was mismatched but battle-worn, their hands restless on their weapons. I stepped forward, voice steady but firm. "We come from Dry Fork. Our village is under siege, surrounded by Jed Cobb's militia. We seek aid, food, medicine, warriors to join the fight for freedom." A long silence stretched between us. Then, the gates creaked open, revealing a woman whose eyes were as sharp as the mountain winds. Her hair was streaked with silver despite her youth, and her stance spoke of unyielding strength. "I am Mara," she said, voice like gravel mixed with steel. You've come far, but Dry Fork's fight is not ours. Or is it? Inside, the settlement pulsed with cautious life. People huddled around fires, sharpening weapons, sharing hushed stories of losses and hopes. Mara led us to a council chamber carved from stone, where leaders from various factions sat in grim conference. I told them our story, how Dry Fork was a beacon for those who refused to bow to tyranny, how we had fought tooth and nail to keep the light alive against the encroaching darkness. My words echoed against the cold stone walls, met with nods and murmurs, but the council was divided. Some argued that aiding Dry Fork was too risky, that Jed Cobb's militia was a beast too great to tame. Others saw the fight as a spark that could ignite a wider rebellion, a chance to reclaim the lands chained by fear. Mara's gaze settled on me, her eyes flickering with a mix of challenge and hope. We can offer warriors and supplies, but only if you pledge this fight will extend beyond Dry Fork. That this war is not just for one village, but for every soul crushed under Cobb's heel. I swallowed hard, the weight of that promise pressing down like a stone in my chest. We fight for all who suffer. Dry Fork is just the beginning. The council agreed to send reinforcements, but with conditions. A coalition would be formed, a united front of disparate groups with one purpose: to topple Jed Cobb's reign and restore freedom to the valley. Weeks passed as we trained and planned alongside our new allies. The air was thick with tension and the scent of iron and smoke. Bonds forged in battle grew stronger, but so did the shadows of doubt and fear. During one cold night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, Mara approached me beside the flickering embers of a dying fire. "This fight will cost us everything," she said softly. "You're ready for that?" I nodded, feeling the weight of every fallen friend, every lost hope. I don't have a choice. Our first coordinated strike was a message to the militia, swift, brutal, and impossible to ignore. We hit a supply convoy under the cover of darkness, dismantling their resources and cutting their lines of communication. The taste of victory was bittersweet. Casualties mounted, and every action drew a harsher response from Cobb's forces. They retaliated with merciless raids, burning crops and taking hostages, spreading terror like wildfire. One evening, news arrived that chilled us all. Clara had been captured during a militia raid while delivering medicine to a nearby village. The camp erupted in chaos. I felt my world fracture. Determined to save her, I gathered a small team for a rescue mission. Mara insisted on coming along. "We fight as one," she said, her gaze fierce. "You don't carry this burden alone." The journey to the militia's stronghold was treacherous. We slipped through twisted forests and across frozen rivers, evading patrols with whispered prayers and silent footsteps. At the edge of the compound, we crouched beneath a jagged rock, eyes locked on the towering walls, lit by flickering torches. Inside, Clara was held in a dim cell, chained but unbroken. Her eyes shone with defiance when I found her. "Don't worry," I whispered. "We're getting you out." The extraction was chaotic. Alarms blared, and malicious soldiers poured into the courtyard like a tide of darkness. We fought tooth and nail, the air thick with smoke, steel, and desperate hope. Mara was a whirlwind of fury and precision, cutting a path through our enemies. We reached the gate, battered and bloodied, but alive. Back in camp, Clara collapsed into my arms, exhaustion overtaking her. "We have to end this," she said weakly, "before more lives are lost." Plans took shape for a final assault on Jed Cobb's fortress. It was a fortress built on fear, guarded by twisted men and a ruthless warlord who thrived on cruelty. We knew the risks known could guarantee survival, but to let the darkness spread was a defeat none of us could accept. The night before battle, I stood on a cliff overlooking the valley, the wind cold against my face. The camp was alive with quiet preparations, prayers whispered into the dark. Mara joined me, her voice low. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already changed this world." I looked at her, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "I hope so." Dawn broke with a blood-red sky. The final battle had come. The clash was cataclysmic. Steel sang against steel. Voices rose in battle, cries and screams. The ground shook beneath the pounding of hooves and the march of countless feet. I fought like a man possessed, every strike fueled by the faces of those I loved, those I lost. Hours stretched into eternity. The fortress walls began to crumble. The militia faltered. At last, we confronted Jed Cobb himself, a monstrous figure cloaked in shadow and rage. The duel was fierce and brutal. Each blow echoed the pain and hope of an entire people. In the end, with a cry that tore through the chaos, I struck him down. Silence fell. The war was over. But victory was not the end, it was a beginning. We stood amid the ruins, weary but unbroken. Clara's hand found mine, steady and warm. Mara's voice carried over the gathering. This valley is free once more, but freedom is a fire we must protect every day, every moment. And so, from the ashes of war, we began to build not just a village, but a future. The battle had ended, but the valley still felt heavy with silence. A silence born of exhaustion, loss, and uncertain hope. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and earth turned over by countless footsteps. Around me, the faces of our allies bore the marks of the fight, some triumphant, others shadowed by the price paid. Clara leaned against the remains of the broken gate, her breath shallow but steady. Mara stood beside her, surveying the horizon where the first light of dawn stretched across a battered but free land. We won the fight, Mara said quietly. But now comes the harder part. Rebuilding. I nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside me. It was one thing to defeat a tyrant, another to heal the wounds left behind. As the survivors gathered, there was a flicker of something new, tentative smiles, cautious laughter, plans whispered beneath tired breaths. The valley would rise again, but it would be a slow and fragile process. Our coalition, once a band of desperate fighters, now had a chance to become something more community-bound, not just by survival, but by shared purpose. Yet I knew the shadows would linger. The scars of war were not easily forgotten, and with freedom came responsibility to protect, to nurture, and to never let fear rule again. The morning sun broke through the scattered clouds, casting a soft golden light over the valley, a light that seemed to promise new beginnings after the darkest of nights. I stood at the edge of what once was a battlefield, now slowly stirring with life. The earth, though scarred, still breathed beneath my boots, reminding me that even the deepest wounds could heal. Around me, the faces of those who had fought by my side reflected a quiet resilience. They were no longer just survivors. They were the keepers of hope, the architects of a future built from ashes. I thought of Miriam, of Elijah, and of every soul lost to fear and hatred. Their memories were no longer chains binding me to silence, but wings urging me forward. I wasn't alone anymore. Together, we had faced storms both of nature and of man, found strength not in weapons, but in trust, in shared grief, and in the courage to believe in something better. The valley would never be the same, nor would I. But maybe that was the point. Change is never easy. It demands sacrifice, patience, and the willingness to stand firm when the world tries to break you. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Silence isn't safety. Silence is loneliness. To truly live, to truly heal, we have to let our voices rise. We have to let the silence break. So here we stand wounded, weary but unbroken. And I know, deep in my bones, that as long as we hold on to each other, there's nothing we can't face. Because sometimes salvation doesn't shout. It knocks. And when it does, you answer. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of courage and hope against all odds, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this journey with those who need to hear that even in the darkest times, light can find a way. Comment below your thoughts, and let's keep this story alive together. Don't forget, sometimes all it takes is one knock for a new beginning.